Good afternoon, dear colleagues, both colleagues that are in here in the room and those attending remotely. Welcome to this meeting of the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance, and thank you for joining us on this very beautiful afternoon here in Strasbourg. As you can see from the draft agenda, our meeting today revolves around two main items. And it's important that we take time to be able to have a very good discussion on these items that we're going to discuss. Both very interesting, I believe. An exchange of views on the forthcoming Handbook for parliamentarians on countering hate speech is one of the items. And the second item we're going to be discussing or talking about is the hearing on countering Islamophobia in Europe, with participation from three very eminent guests that we have invited here today, guest speakers. We will also exchange on the recent and future activities of the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance. It's important that those of you that are not members, that want to be members, to try to contact the Bureau or me, so we'll make sure that you can join, because it's important in these days where we have so much hate, both online and offline, so we are as many members of Parliament as possible that would stand against that hate and promote a different narrative. So those are the two main items. And then if you look at the agenda, I think each one of you have a copy of the agenda. We can start the meeting by trying to adopt the draft agenda. I see no request to take the floor, so can we adopt it? Yes, thank you. The second point on the agenda, which is the activities of No Hate Parliamentary Alliance. As I mentioned, this is an alliance that constitutes of members of parliament that are interested in fighting against racism, fighting against hate and intolerance. And as I said earlier on, the more we are, the better and the stronger. So if you want to be a part of this alliance, please let us know, so you can be part of the alliance and you can take part in the activities that we have. Which I'm going to mention some of the activities that we're planning to have now. The work of the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance is more relevant than ever. Racism, intolerance and discrimination are rife in Europe. Increasingly, new cases every week remind us the structural and institutional racism still plague our society. Recently, a Dutch court ruled that police can use ethnicity as one of the criteria for selecting people for check at the border. Racial profiling at the border. In this institution, we recently wrote a report that we adopted on racial profiling, and that report makes it very clear that this is a huge problem, that people are stopped based on their race, based on their color, based on their religion, and that has no legal basis. But the Dutch court set a precedence, because they're saying it is legal for the police to stop you based on your skin color, based on your religion, based on your ethnicity. So this is a very worrying situation that we're seeing because of this Dutch court ruling. So we need to do something about it. The decision is a reason for serious concern and a clear manifestation of institutional racism. It perpetuates and normalizes racial profiling and is contradiction with the principle of non-discrimination that we are here to uphold. This case shows that we need to step up our efforts in the fight against racism and intolerance. I would like to update you on the main activities of the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance. Earlier this year, a compilation of texts adopted by the Parliamentary Assembly in the area of racism, intolerance and hate speech was published by the Secretariat of the Assembly. It is available in electronic format on the web page of the Alliance, and I will invite you all to consult it. The recent development is that a French version has just been prepared. French-speaking colleagues, do not hesitate to use it in your parliamentary work. This is a tool that we developed because we come here and we adopt a lot of legal tools that normally we don't even remember we adopted. And in our work back home, we reinvent the wheel, because we will need tools that we can use, and instead of using tools that we already have, we try to do it again. So what we've done is we've compiled all these necessary relevant legal tools that we have in one document, so that you can have access to it and you can use it in the work that you do at your national parliament. It's both in English and in French, so please go to the website, download it and use it. The main purpose is for us to use it. On the same line, a handbook of parliamentarians will be prepared and published in the coming months. This is not meant as a compilation of text, but rather as a practical tool to be used by parliamentarians, but possibly also by activists and media people. We'll get back to that story today, because it's one of the points that we'll be discussing here today. Another development that I consider particularly important is a parliamentary conference in diversity, inclusiveness and non-discrimination against racism and intolerance in Europe. It's being co-organized by the Swedish delegation to the Assembly and the Secretariat of the Alliance, and it will take place in hybrid format in Paris and online on the Kudos platform on the 25th of October 2021. As General Rapporteur, I have the possibility in my mandate to organize one conference, and this is the conference that I intend to organize that will focus on the rise of the extreme right, but also talk about diversity and some of the tools that we have in order to be able to fight against this development. So 25th of October, if you have time and possibility, it would be great if you can participate. As I mentioned, it's going to be a hybrid format. So if you can participate in Paris, you can come physically, that's great, that's even better. If you have no possibility of traveling to Paris, please, you can join online. The more we are, the better. It's going to be a high-profile meeting. We're inviting people from the UN and from the EU, and it's important that those of us that are working with this issue are present so we can contribute and show and take a stand, basically, against racism and intolerance in Europe. You are probably also already familiar with the draft program of the conference, as it was sent last week by email to all Alliance members. And if you are not an Alliance member and you want to have access to it, please let us know. We have a draft program which is really, really good. I would like to encourage you to attend and participate actively in the conference, either physically, as I said, at the Council of Europe office in Paris, or online. Does any member wish to take the floor or comment or have any suggestions? No. Thank you. Then it is time to go to our next item in the agenda, the exchange of views on the forthcoming handbook. As I mentioned, this handbook is extremely important. We have a distinguished guest with Ms. Chara Bakalis, Principal Lecturer in Law, Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Oxford Brookes University. Dear colleagues, many of you are familiar with the Handbook for Parliamentarians on the Istanbul Convention. I think I have a copy of it here. Yes, this handbook is extremely important, and it's important that all of you have access to it. And I think most of you, or at least a lot of you, have access to this handbook. A powerful tool to end gender-based violence. This is a popular publication that's been translated into multiple languages, and often at the initiative of national delegations to the Parliamentary Assembly, and has been used by a great number of people, of fellow parliamentarians also. So the idea now is to publish another handbook, just like this one, this time on countering hate speech. We know hate speech is rampant, it's increasing, so we need to create ways and means in order to be able to make it easier for us to be able to fight against hate speech. So we're going to do exactly something like this that we've done when it comes to the Istanbul Convention. And we create a handbook on countering hate speech as part of the activities of the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance. To this end, we will cooperate with faculties of Humanities and Social Sciences of Oxford Brookes University, and specifically with Ms. Chara Bakalis, Principal Lecturer in Law. So allow me, first of all, to welcome our guest expert, Ms. Bakalis. Thank you very much I hope you are online. Thank you very much for being with us today. And thank you, of course, for accepting to work on this project with our Secretariat. We can expect the handbook to be helpful in several ways. First of all, it will provide information to parliamentarians on Council of Europe standards in the area of hate speech. This is a topical issue, and several bodies within this organisation have worked extensively on it. So there is a wide range of Parliamentary Assembly adopted text, but also recommendations coming from the Committee of Ministers, and of course the general policy recommendation issued by ECRI. On the other hand, the handbook may present good practices that may inspire legislation and policies in our countries. Today we have an opportunity to share information and views and to indicate what we expect from such a handbook. It is going to be our handbook, so it is important that we come with input to discuss what we expect it to be. This is a very early stage in the preparation of this handbook. The work has just started, and we can contribute to shaping it. Ms. Bakalis, would you like to tell us a bit more about your approach to this matter, and what kind of input from us would be most helpful and useful and have an added value to the work that you're doing? The floor is yours. You need to request the floor so we can... Good.
Everybody, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me here today. So I've got a little bit of feedback, slightly putting me off, but I'll try and ignore it. Okay, so
if you checked on your screen the language option part, you can change it to floor.
Thank you very much. That's helped. Yeah, that's perfect. As you've just explained, we're still in the very early stages of writing this handbook. So any suggestions that you may have of what you might find useful would be so helpful before we even begin writing it, so that this can be as helpful to you as possible. As you've just explained, we will be going through basic Council of Europe standards and also looking at good practice from other countries. But please let me know if there's anything else you'd like to go in there. From my point of view, I definitely want to make sure that there is quite a bit of emphasis on online hate speech, because that's an area that is very new still, and trying to tackle it at the legislative level is going to need quite a lot of thought. I would quite like to think carefully about whether or not the usual mantra in this area is what's a crime offline should be a crime online. But I think we may need to think about this more carefully and think about whether or not we need to give more thought to the online world as its own space, and think about legislating specifically for the online world rather than simply transposing what we have offline onto the online world, because I don't think it will necessarily work. So any comments you have on that would be helpful. Certainly also, I think here we also have to think about regulating social media. Again, particularly in the online world, this is not just about regulating individuals, but actually regulating companies and thinking about how we hold them responsible. And of course, in this area, the biggest issue really is how we balance all of these legislative measures with freedom of expression, how we ensure that we allow people to express themselves freely, and that we as liberal democracies allow citizens to say what they want, but that there are proper limitations in place when speech becomes harmful. So I think that's all I really wanted to say. I really want to hear what you all have to say, and hear any recommendations you have for good practice, as well as any particular problems that you think need to be addressed in the toolkit.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Bakalis. I will give you the floor at the end of the debate for your comments. Do not hesitate to request the floor when you feel the need to do so. Dear colleagues, you've heard our guests, and I will now open the floor for your contributions. She mentioned legislation for both online and offline. The online and offline world, normally we see them differently, but they're not supposed to be different. To try to create a balance between what is seen as freedom of expression and then what is seen as hate speech. I think these are very important points. But I would like you to reflect or hear your reflections on these issues. Have you ever taken part in debates on hate speech in your national parliaments, for example? Is any piece of legislation under preparation in this area in your country? Have you already found yourself in the situation of needing more information and international standards or other country policies on hate speech? What are your ideas? What are your thoughts? What are your questions? What are your reflections? I see my chair here, Peter Bayer, want to take the floor. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Momodou Malcolm. I wrote my master thesis about hate speech and the legal situation in Austria about it, and how the law enforcement institutions managed to follow up, or better not to follow up, with hate speech in general. But I also was involved in the writing of various parliamentary handbooks, for instance, self-assessment, how to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, and sexual and reproductive rights and others. And from that experience, I know that, first of all, it's very, very motivating if this handbook includes concrete examples of MPs who got active in their countries and initiated whatever, with a portrait, with their story, a short version of that, but also with the outcome and what it really changed, what the impact was. And on the other hand, what I would consider useful is a kind of checklist when it comes to ECRI recommendation 15, which is on combating hate speech, and it gives advice on legal measurements that should be taken. And I think it could be also following the idea of self-assessment, to see what the respective country already has done and where there are still voids, where is something still left to do. So I would suggest these two approaches, among others, of course.
Thank you very much, Petra. Do you have any more? Yes, please.
Dear colleagues, hello. I want to share one story with you, because we experienced it for last month, I should say. I work in Ukrainian Parliament with my colleague Jean Belenyuk. He is a sportsman also, and during this year Olympic Games he won gold medal for our country. But after he experienced the case of racism on the street, and hate speech against him. And this was a very loud, I should say, information case in our media space. And it, of course, raised the national, I should say, the communication discussion about the problem of racism. At the same time, how we react, our law enforcement, of course, they made an investigation, and this investigation was also public. So I suppose that even when we have legal instruments how to protect people, how to stand against racism or intolerance, we still need to make such stories public, to inform people that it is not normality. We need to protect everyone and be equal within our societies. Yeah? That's why media campaigns, they are effective, and even in these cases, case I shared with you, was also shown the positive result, how to protect people and how to stand against racism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Badina. Media campaigns, checklist, self-assessment. These are some of the suggestions. If you can somehow put yourself in a position in which, in your own parliament, you need a document, and this document is supposed to serve as aid, to help you fight against hate speech, what would you want to see in this document? What would you think would be relevant to be included in this document that you think can help you in your work in fighting against hate speech? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. So, hate speech on the internet typically crosses international borders. So if we could have some evidence base or a bit more best practice on how we deal with that. The previous speaker spoke about the element of enforcement. If it's a domestic conversation, that's a lot easier to enforce. Where it crosses international boundaries, there is a tendency of not necessarily being able to navigate that to the point of a successful outcome.
Thank you very much. Enforcement is always the case. I mean, it's always a tricky one. We have a lot of legal tools, but when it comes to enforcing these tools, that's where we normally find it problematic. But I would also like to assume that even though we work with legal tools, sometimes not everything has to be legal. Sometimes we need to find other ways and means outside the legal framework to be able to work in creating a different narrative, for example. Any thoughts around that? Yes, Peter.
Yeah, maybe one more, because there is a very fine line between hate speech and freedom of speech, and where do you distinguish, and what is allowed and what not. And maybe as Elodie and I am working at a report on anti-Semitism, there is this working definition on anti-Semitism that works a lot with examples, showing what is anti-Semitism and what is it not. So it might be also useful to follow this approach to answer the question, what is hate speech at all and what is it not?
Exactly. I totally agree. I think that's a very good start. I mean, if you don't know what hate speech is, you find it difficult to act. I think that's something that I think is relevant for this handbook, to have kind of a vivid description of what is considered to be hate speech, because there's always this misunderstanding that freedom of expression is exactly unlimited. You can say whatever you want as long as you call it freedom of expression, which is not true. So it's important to have some kind of a conversation, or at least some idea as to why it stops, so that those of us that are members of parliament would know what is considered as hate speech and not, and how to react. Okay, we have one request online. Khalil, please. Let's give you the floor before we give the floor back to our guest speaker. Thank you.
Ja, hallo, ich spreche auf...
Yes, I'm going to speak German, if that's all right with you. Thank you. I wanted to, if I may, pick up on a point when it comes to racism. Perhaps we could ask what definitions there are out there, what it means exactly. Racism, what does it mean exactly? I think that this is something we could delve a little deeper into. And I think that it's something that's sometimes underestimated. Particularly, you'll see that in some schools these issues are addressed, in others not. So in the field of education, I think that this is something we need to give some careful consideration to. We talked earlier on about legal aspects and legal references. In Austria, you actually have studies in this regard when it comes to police violence and the way it impacts upon these issues and how difficult it is for individuals to get access to their rights. Also the question of legal proceedings, how costly they might be, how difficult to afford they might be. So it's a question of access to the courts, access to your rights, being allowed to and empowered to fight for your rights. It's not something that goes without saying. It's actually rather difficult. So these are some of the points that I would suggest we address when it comes to the legal area in particular. Anyway, there have been some studies in this area. I mentioned them earlier on. And we've seen instances of racist police violence, abuse. I think 1,500 different cases, and they all, many of them went to court, but in no single case was there actually a finding in their favour or to find this particular breach. That is a problem. That is a real problem. So I think we need to look not only at the question of the law and legal texts, but also look at what society does about this. What is society doing in order to combat racism? It's a question of socialization. Of course, it's a question of what we learn in our socialization. And I think that this is something that should not be underestimated. So to try to basically improve the atmosphere in our societies and our approach to this whole problem. That's the point I would flag. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you, colleagues. We've had the suggestions, the opinions, great suggestions too. And Ms. Bakalis, would you like to comment on some of the things that have been said here today? And I assume There is always a possibility to come with new suggestions. If you have any, you can always feel free to email us, contact us, because we want this document, this tool to be as efficient and effective as possible, so we'll be able to make use of it. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. Those were excellent comments. You won't have been able to see me, but I've been scribbling notes furiously and nodding the whole way through. Hopefully, I can include most of these things, if not all, in some form or another in the handbook. But please, if you think of anything else, or particularly any examples that you think that you'd like to see in there, either of MPs who've worked on this, who you know have been very successful, or any kind of media campaigns that you think it's worth including in there as examples to everybody else, to be helpful to everybody else, please do let me know. But thank you very much for your input. It's been very valuable.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Bakalis. We look forward to seeing the outcome of your work and wish you all the success. And again, if you have any further suggestions, ideas, thoughts, please don't hesitate to contact us. Now we move on to the main event of this afternoon, countering Islamophobia in Europe. It is a regular feature of our meetings to hold hearings on different forms of racism and discrimination, from anti-Semitism to Afrophobia, anti-Gypsyism, and now Islamophobia. There are various implications we have possibility to discuss, and hopefully we'll do that this afternoon. I'm currently preparing a report on Islamophobia, and I am confident that today's hearing will provide a wealth of relevant information that can be used as an added value and food for thought on how to conduct the preparation of the report. I hope that we will all learn more on this form of discrimination that we know is rife in Europe. Islamophobia is increasingly becoming a problem in Europe. It is a problem in Europe, and we need to somehow confront it. We need to talk about it. We need to find solutions and the way forward. So allow me to welcome our three guests. Ms. Julie Pascoet, Policy Officer, European Network Against Racism. ENAR is one of the main anti-racist networks in Europe. I have had the privilege to be the Vice Chair of ENAR for many years. I worked together with them and traveled around Europe talking about racism and fighting against racism. So we are very glad to have you here, Julie. We have Mr. Tufyal Choudhury, Associate Professor, Durham University, and we have Ms. Dunia Khalil, Project Dokustelle from Vienna. So please welcome, help me in welcoming these amazing speakers that we have today. Let me start with Julie. You have worked extensively on Islamophobia at ENAR, and I'm very familiar with your work. As I mentioned, I worked together with you for many years. Lately, you have focused your attention, among other things, on gendered Islamophobia. That is, on the intersection between discrimination on the grounds of religion and gender. Muslim women are severely impacted by Islamophobia. So would you like to tell us more about the work that you're doing on this issue? Please, the floor is yours, Julie. You have to request the floor. And I also mentioned you have about 7 minutes. Thank you.
Hello. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Thank you very much. That's the first question for any intervention at the moment. Thank you very much for having me. I'm indeed working at the European Network Against Racism, a network of anti-racist organizations across Europe. We are now 180 organizations in Europe working on different forms of racism, as you mentioned. And so indeed, one of our field area of work is the fight against Islamophobia, because we believe that there is a need of recognition of the different specificities of racism. So racism can manifest itself in many different ways, and it's important to recognize them in order to better address them. There are different histories, there are different ways that, and different construction that in Europe that actually has an impact on the experiences of racialized groups. So first, when it comes to Islamophobia, of course, this is key to recognize it as a form of racism. And it's not always the case until now in Europe, but this is key in order to understand that there is a group of people in Europe that is being actually constructed as a homogeneous group to which negative attributes are ascribed. And this is of course very important to understand that the way they are constructed actually is a social construct, and is even though Muslims, even though these people targeted by Islamophobia.
Excuse me for interrupting you. Do you have your language select on floor?
Yes.
Okay. Good.
Is it okay? Can you hear me? Or?
Yes, we can try again. You can.
Yes. So. Yes, I was mentioning about the importance to recognize it as a form of racism, and that's also why we understand Islamophobia as targeting Muslims and people perceived as Muslims, because indeed there are different characteristics that are used to identify people are Muslims, even though they are not necessarily Muslims, and they are targeted by race. They are targeted by races also due to some markers. Religious markers, but also ethnic markers. That's also why we talk about the importance to recognize it as a structural form of inequality, meaning that racial prejudice.
Excuse me, Julie, I'm really sorry interrupting you. The network somehow is not working too well, so we don't. Our interpreters are not hearing you correctly. Do you have a headset?
Yes, I have a headset.
Can you try that, please? Thank you.
No, I have it.
Oh, you have it on.
It's here. Yeah.
Okay. Can you try?
I can try to.
Can you try without a headset? Can you try with
my headset?
Yeah, to see if that's different. Thank you.
Okay.
No, it's not on. We can't hear you at all now. The microphone is off. We can see the sign. So if you put it on, try again. It's not working. Okay, there isn't much we can do for how to put on the headsets and try again. Okay. Try with the headsets again if it doesn't work without the headset, because we can't hear you at all now. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very sorry for this inconvenience. We want to make sure that those that do not speak English have access to what you're saying and can hear and understand, so that they'll be able to comment. We try once again, and then if it doesn't work, then we move on to the second speaker, and we see what happens. Can you request the floor again? Thank you. Okay, we will move on to Mr. Choudhury instead, and then we'll see if we can find some solution to the technical problems that Julie is facing. Mr. Choudhury, I understand that you have researched various aspects of Islamophobia in the United Kingdom and beyond, I myself sat in a panel with you not very long ago, and I thought your ideas and your research is extremely important. So would you like to share your findings on this with us? Please, the floor is yours. If you can request the floor, we can let you in. Thank you.
Can I also check that you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. As you mentioned, I've conducted research both in the UK but across Europe looking at the impact and effects of counter-terrorism measures on minority and racialized communities. And so I thought I'd take the few minutes in today's presentation just to identify what I think are three mechanisms by which counter-terrorism measures reinforce, support and sustain Islamophobia, as well as three consequences of counter-terrorism measures and policies. So looking at the first three mechanisms by which counter-terrorism measures reinforce, support and sustain Islamophobia, the first is a broad definition of terrorism. So most European countries have adopted a wide and broad definition of terrorism. The definitions usually include kind of three basic elements. Action, that can often be violence against people or property, but also threats of violence or actions endangering public health. And this action has to have an aim of influencing or intimidating a government or the public. And finally, the action has an ideological motivation. The challenge here is that the broad definition encompasses a far wider range of potential actions than are actually treated treated as terrorism. So the broad definition has the capacity to capture a wide range of actions. For example, it could cover environmental protesters, animal rights activists, anti-lockdown protesters. Their actions could all potentially be regarded as terrorism. As a consequence, there's a big gap between the vast universe of things that could be treated as terrorism and those that are actually treated as terrorism. And with such a broad legal definition, the question arises, how are the police, security officials and prosecutors deciding who are the real targets of terrorist measures, if not these legal definitions? And here what we come to is the reliance on the creation of a common sense idea of who a terrorist is. The problem is, of course, that a common sense is a racialized common sense. And so there is an underpinning of an imagination of who is a terrorist that influences decisions as to who is treated as a terrorist. For example, between 2006 and 2019, 70% of terrorist attacks in Europe were planned or carried out by ethno-nationalist or separatist groups. Yet in the public and political discourse, terrorism is almost exclusively linked to violence inspired by Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and therefore linked to Islam. Right-wing violence, by contrast, is only rarely counted as terrorism. And I think this sort of failure to adequately report, record, or charge right-wing violence and activism as terrorism perpetuates a misconception about the nature of terrorist threat, encourages Islamophobia while reducing vigilance against other types of terrorism. So that's the first problem, is the broad definition and how it's used and the extent to which an imagination of who is a terrorist informs who is treated as a terrorist. But related to that is the second mechanism, which is the development of pre-crime offences. So pre-crime offences have been developed broadly across European countries, and they're pre-crime in the sense that they move away from the traditional approach to criminalisation. So traditional criminalisation criminalises harmful acts of individuals. Pre-crime offences often criminalise actions which in and of themselves don't interfere with the rights or interests of others, but are seen as potentially dangerous because of the intention of the person involved. So these can be things like possession of documents that could be useful for terrorism, training or traveling for the purposes of terrorism. So the actions themselves, the possession of a document, A to Z map, for example, or learning how to use night vision glasses, or booking a flight to another country, the actions in themselves aren't dangerous, but it's the intention by which that's attached to the action that makes them criminalized. The problem here is that these intentions are often based on predicting what the future activity of the person will be, what the future actions of the person is. And so the intention is often based on what their views are, what their ideas are, who they may associate with, what kind of websites they visit. So again, it kind of perpetuates the idea of who is seen as a terrorist, what kind of person is seen as the sort of person that would have that intention, because the actions themselves aren't seen as directly dangerous. And then the third mechanism is counter-radicalization policies. So these also reinforce a sense of Islamophobia. They often rely on the notion of indicators of radicalization. The evidence for those indicators are at best deeply contested. I think the researchers would say that the absence of indicators of a terrorist is not the failure of research, but the consequence of research. And many of these policies often explicitly focus on Muslim or Muslim communities and therefore reproduce a binary between moderate and extremist Muslims, the good or the bad Muslim, often drawing a distinction between, for example, Islam and Islamism. And this moderate extremist Islamism binary reinforces the perception that the problem of terrorist violence lies within Islam, and that the need to work with Muslims and Muslim communities makes Islam both the cause and the cure for radicalization. As the Australian academic Randa Abdul Fattah notes, in the war on terror, every Muslim is infected with a dormant virus that must offer an immunization record, a reassurance that their strain of Muslimness that they contain is safe. Crucially, both extremists and moderate Muslims are objects of policing and security. They exist on a continuum. Both are objects of state intervention and control. And the need to distinguish between moderates, Muslims, and extremists, police and policy are hoping that they can focus on the extremists without being seen to openly profile individuals based on their race and religion. However, scholars of race draw attention to the ways in which counter-terrorism policies and practices intensify existing processes of racialization of Muslims. So those are the three mechanisms I want to draw attention to: the broad definition of terrorism, the expansion and development of pre-crime offences, and counter-radicalization. And then with ENAR, we carried out research on the impact of these measures on minority communities. And so I want to draw attention to the three impacts. The first is suspicion of Muslim identities and religious practices. The second is discrimination, harassment, and abuse. And the third is increased surveillance. The suspicion of Muslim identities and religious practices, what we've seen is that increasingly Muslim religious identities, religious practices become a trigger of suspicion, both from state officials, but also from ordinary members of the public who are worried about terrorism. So everything from wearing a headscarf to praying to using Arabic words all can trigger suspicion and can lead to people thinking, well, is this person an extremist or are they moderate, and therefore becomes a basis for increasing suspicion of Muslims. And as a result, people begin to self-censor. They're not able to fully enjoy their freedom of expression, their freedom of religion, and so on. One example was that we had in the research were prayer rooms in universities in Germany where the prayer room was closed because the security officials at university thought that the prayer rooms might be used for radicalization. And so they took it on themselves. This wasn't something that was sanctioned, but they took it on themselves to close them because they feared potential radicalization, because they'd heard about this thing happening in mosques. And so mosques become organizations that are viewed with suspicion and viewed with fear by the wider community. The second aspect is just discrimination and harassment. So increasingly, in line with a lot of research in Europe, we see that discrimination is also racialized and often based around the security threat of Muslims. So that Muslim women in particular, but also Muslim men, face forms of abuse, of discrimination that shows that they're seen as a security threat. And then the final point I wanted to make is around surveillance and suspicion. So, because of widespread sort of approaches towards counter-radicalization, which the whole of society approach, everyone is encouraged to look out for potential signs of radicalization. And what tends to happen is people see things that they're not familiar with, and often they're not familiar with Muslim religious practices, Muslim religious actions, activities, identities, and so those become things that are reported. They become the source of suspicion, and so people increasingly find that they have to police their own actions, police their own behavior, police their own expression of their religious identity, because they're under surveillance, not just from the police or from the state, but also through kind of phone lines that encourage people to report what they see as suspicious, from their own neighbours, from their own colleagues, so living under a constant state of suspicion. And another consequence is that they then distance themselves from those they themselves think might come under suspicion. So that also creates division within communities where people try to stay away from those within their own communities rather than showing solidarity, stay away from people that they fear might come under suspicion. So those are the three consequences I wanted to highlight from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those really, really very interesting points. Just without further ado, let me just move quickly to Ms. Khalil. You represent Dokustelle project, the Dokustelle project based in Vienna in Austria, which aims to document the Islamophobic incidents occurring in Austria. So please, the floor is yours. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about this project on documenting Islamophobia in Austria?
Ja, vielen Dank. Schönen Nachmittag.
Good afternoon. Yes, I'm at Dokustelle and I'm a racism advisor. We focus on anti-Muslim racism in Austria. And we gather information on anti-Muslim racism in the country. We gather statistics, we analyze it. The idea is to provide a picture of anti-Muslim racism in Austria. Of course, what we are showing is only the tip of the iceberg. We gather information from witnesses, and our aim is to contribute to a society which is more resilient in countering racism. We want this phenomenon to be recognized, and we want to develop measures to counter hate speech and Islamophobia, because we feel that these phenomena are very deeply anchored in Austrian society. Now, the institute so-called Political Islam was set up in 2020. It singles out one religion, one religious minority in Austria. And it essentially means that Muslim communities are under general suspicion of posing a potential threat to national security. And the definition of political Muslim, rather political Islam, is extremely broad. The definition used by this documentation center. And this shows that we're moving away from a presumption of innocence towards a perception that because people are Muslims, they may be criminals as well. They may be a threat. Now we have the Anti-Terrorism Act, which has just been enacted in Austria. This has been criticized, and it is felt that it could be misused and could actually worsen discrimination against Muslims. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Says Mrs. Khalil.
Okay. Eine Untersuchungsgruppe.
So an investigative committee has looked into this and says that there is no need for this extra Counter-Terrorism Act. It doesn't have any added value. It seeks to criminalize religiously motivated extremist links. And what is recommended is not a Counter-Terrorism Act, but cultural preventive measures. And we've seen, as a result, an increase in demonstrations of hatred against Muslims and the use of hate speech against Muslims. And nevertheless, the feelings of Muslims who are under suspicion are not taken into account. We've also seen the reaction of the UN Special Rapporteur's communication on the Anti-Terrorism Act. The Terrorism Act having featured very widely in the media. Our fear is that this will actually prevent people from enjoying their religious freedom, and that this will instigate discrimination against them, and that they will feel that they can't be free to practice their religion. Let me give you another example of what we're trying to counter, the so-called Islam map. This map shows over 620 mosques and other Muslim organizations, youth centers, cultural associations. And the danger of this is that it could be a focus for anti-Islamic attacks. And there have been cases where one has seen notices put up saying, watch out, this is a Muslim organization or center or something. And there have been threats against mosques. So we've seen guns used to threaten Muslim women, and this is one further example of how an atmosphere of Islamophobia is being prompted. But if you work on this, you're very quickly accused of being too Islamic, too Muslim. I also mention the CCIF, the French Collective for Countering Islamophobia, which is supposed to provide, this CCIF is supposed to provide Muslims who have experienced discrimination and threats with legal assistance and other kinds of support. But the CCIF has been dissolved, and the only thing that has been found against it is its definition of institutionalized Islam. And it has been criticized for making a capital out of the threats that Muslims and the Islamic community have faced. And the point is that the phenomena that we're countering are not just a feature of Austrian society, but broader.
To invite some of the members here to say something. You will have a chance to say something at the end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say, ich wollte nur sagen,
just one last thing. The danger is that Islamophobia will become accepted and normalized. And the studies have shown that Austrians, for instance, in a significant proportion, don't wish to have Muslims as neighbours. This is the sort of result of an atmosphere of Islamophobia, and this is the kind of atmosphere and the kind of situation which we are seeking to counter in the Dokustelle that I represent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Khalil. Unfortunately, we were unable to hear Julie's entire presentation. What we'll do is we'll try to make sure that we provide the presentations of the three speakers so you can have access to them. But what Julie was essentially talking about is gendered Islamophobia, where we have the intersection between gender, you are a woman, and you are a Muslim. If you are a woman, you're facing discrimination because of your gender. If you are a woman and Muslim, you're facing both these discriminations. And if you are a woman Muslim with a veil, even more kind of discrimination. So there's these intersections. If you're a woman and a black woman, a woman of color, and Muslim, and with a veil, those are several kinds of discriminations that intersect with one another. So this is a serious issue that affects women, and it's extremely important that we speak about. But I would like to hear your thoughts and your ideas, because these are thought-provoking presentations, and I now open the floor to discuss them. First, I would like to give the floor to the Senator from Kazakhstan, and I would please ask you to take 3 minutes, not more than 3 minutes, so that we can have as many people as possible join the conversation. 3 minutes. Please, the Senator, the floor is yours.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say how grateful we are to this committee for the opportunity to speak at this afternoon's meeting. Kazakhstan is taking very clear steps to promote gender equality, and significant progress has been achieved in this regard. We reached the UN SDGs in advance related to gender equality. We have a gender policy, we have a legal basis, and a human rights protection mechanism. We have two relevant laws, one on equality of rights and equality of opportunities for men and women, and secondly on countering domestic violence. We are members of the Beijing Declaration and the UN CEDAW Convention against discrimination against women. And we have also ratified the optional protocol to that convention. We have a unique coordinating body, which is the Presidential Committee on Women's Issues and Family and Demographic Policy. This commission includes members of Parliament, and they are in charge of coordinating the activities of the state administration when it comes to promoting gender equalities. The commission takes part in the drafting of relevant laws, strategies, conceptual frameworks, and it interviews managers of state authorities and departments to make sure that if there's any violation of the law against the law on encouraging gender equality, that these matters are the object of attention. The President has ensured a broad-based strategy for reform, and this has led to a 30% quota for young people and women as candidates for elections. And the most recent parliamentary elections led to about 27% of deputies being women in the lower house. Women in Kazakhstan are occupying managerial positions in small and medium-sized businesses. They are the leaders of about 43% of our small companies. Women are also playing a key role in the economy by creating jobs. Kazakhstan is one of the countries with a very high level of gender development and is country number 1 amongst the ICE countries when it comes to the Gender Development Index. We are also 72nd out of 153 countries on the gender gap, rather the Global Gender Gap Index, which is the World Economic Forum's index. We are gradually reforming our legislation to take into account these issues. Parliament and the Interior Ministry, for instance, work closely with civil society on a law to counter domestic violence. We have a gender strategy, a gender equality strategy, 2017-2027, and a conceptual framework for gender policy and family policy up to 2030. And these norms are in keeping with the norms enshrined in the Istanbul Convention. Thank you for your attention.
Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you also for the very interesting inputs. Listening to Mr. Choudhury, who made a very good systematization of hate towards other groups, bring me to the idea that there are very many similarities between all these dislike of the unlike among this othering of whomever. And I happened to participate on last Friday in Vienna at an event organized by some LGBTIQ NGOs. It was called Together Against Hate. And also there it became clear that if we talk about homophobia or racism, it's more or less often the same people who are the hostile ones. And it's totally the same patterns and the same motivations and the same reasons and the same expressions and even the same legal basis very, very often. And I would like to ask Mrs. Khalil, and I will switch to Austrian now. Frau Khalil.
Mrs. Khalil, may I ask you, bearing in mind that we're talking here about structures of anti-Muslim racist sentiment. You have patterns. It's also very similar to homophobic attacks. So I was wondering, how do you distinguish between these different types, these different typologies? On Friday, we had this event. We had a participant called Chara, who was there representing her institution. And obviously there were a lot of LGBTIQ organizations also attending the event. And what's clear to me is that each group needs its own contact point, if you like, an office to whom to turn. A young Muslim will be more inclined to turn to a specific organization, a particular organization. If there's an attack, if there's some kind of assault, they would rather do that. Rather than perhaps a young lesbian woman or a Jewish person. It's important to have an interlocutor to whom you can relate, to whom you can turn, in other words. But, I'm wondering how you address these issues, because after all, there are also a lot of parallelisms between these different types of hatred. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we let you in, Ms. Khalil, let's allow one of our members here to ask or comment, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you to the speakers for their really interesting talk. It would be interesting to hear their views on which country is getting it right in terms of the balance between security and civil liberties, and also what they would propose as potential solutions to this from a legislative perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Khalil and Tufyal, I think the floor is yours. If you can just within 3 minutes try to answer the questions or reflect on the comments. Thank you. We start with you, Ms. Khalil.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that really important question. I mean, yes, of course, we work on all types of violation and we have different organisations and they all do really important work. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we're all fighting discrimination, whatever type of discrimination. We're all in this together. So yes, of course, you can provide extra support. For instance, Dokustelle, as far as we're concerned, we're most of us volunteers, or some of us have part-time jobs, but we're doing this alongside our other obligations. So unfortunately, we can't do as much as we would like to do. A lot of this is on a voluntary basis, so support is important. Like I said, we're doing this work, and there are plenty of other people involved in other anti-racism bodies. But yes, you raise an important point. I think we do need to have exchanges between these different entities because that can be very valuable in order to help provide better protection and in order to help create a society that is ever more anti-racist. So thank you for your question, Madam.
Thank you. Let's see if Tufyal is online too. Yes. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think on the question of which countries are doing it better, it's a difficult question in terms of identifying specific countries. In some aspects, and also because my knowledge isn't comprehensive in this area, but I think there are some countries where, for example, when it comes to the precursor offences, these are more tightly drawn and more carefully drawn in Germany compared to the UK, for example. So that's one example. But I think the wider question of what kinds of solutions we're looking for, I would suggest that there are a couple of things that would be helpful. One is more careful analysis of the human rights and equality impacts of counterterrorism measures before they're enacted. So there's sort of more clear examination of their potential impact. I would also recommend that any legislation should have a sunset clause so that it goes back to parliaments to think carefully about whether these measures are still required in the future rather than being permanent and continuously in place. And then there should be a greater role for equality and human rights bodies at the national level, anti-discrimination bodies, to continuously evaluate the impact of security and counterterrorism measures on minority groups and on everybody in terms of their human rights and the rule of law principles. So I think those are kind of structural ways in which you can ensure that there's greater adherence to and respect for both human rights, equality and the rule of law when these policies not only enacted but also subsequently implemented.
Thank you very much. I think Julie is also online. So Julie, if you request, so you can have the floor. Let's give it a try and see if it works this time.
I would like to offer some responses to the very interesting questions, especially when it comes to intersectional approach to the fight against racism and inequalities. I think it's very important to build stronger coalition across groups in order to better address inequalities, because in the end they are all interlinked. A Muslim can be impacted by homophobia, can be impacted by Afrophobia, anti-black racism can be impacted by anti-Gypsyism. So they really need to have a more coalition-building approach when it comes to fighting against racism, against inequalities. Also in the term of policy design, it's very important also to have an intersectional approach in designing policies. So yes, indeed, we can have specific policies fighting against racism, but this is important to ensure that other policies are also contributing to the efforts to fight against racism. For example, if you have gender equality policies that are contributing to actually exclude Muslim women from education or from employment, then that's counterproductive, and that's actually failing to have an intersectional approach in order to reach full equality for all. So it's also very important, and this is also something we are advocating for when we ask for concrete policies. this is actually key. And I would like to finish also by stressing again the need to build counter-narrative. And it's clear now, I mean, after what we've heard from Tufyal and from Dunia, that the counter-terrorism narrative is really framing Muslims as the problem in Europe today, as the guilty one, before any a priori guilty one. So it's also key that we have strong public figures such as politicians, policymakers, that also are vocal against narratives against Muslims, because these narratives, as we have heard, are actually fitting into policies, fitting into practices, fitting into legislation, and in the end infringing the rights of all. Because as we've heard from Tufyal, I mean, the rule of law issues are actually increasing because also of these abuses when it comes to infringing of rights.
Thank you very much. I think we'll have one more round before we conclude. And before I give you the floor, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to have your hands up or comments. I just wanted to ask, when it comes to there is a narrative about Islam and Muslims that we see in Europe that is quite disturbing. I'm going to give you two examples. When you look at, for example, one of the most dangerous terrorists that we've had in Europe, who is Breivik from Norway, he's not a Muslim. And he killed more people than any other terrorist in modern time. He bombed a government building, but yet if you follow the media coverage, terrorism was never, it was never associated to a person like that. The first media coverage was about, this is some Muslim terror network that has done this, is responsible for this. But when they realized that, no, it's this white Norwegian guy who is not a Muslim, who's not from the Middle East, then the discussion and the rhetoric shifted. Now it's more about a Sikh individual and not about a racist terrorist that is based on an ideology of hate. Why do we make these differences? Why is it that whenever it's a Muslim, then we're quick to say it's a terrorist network, and we never talk about the individual's mental health? But whenever it is not a Muslim or it is not a person of color, then we talk about the person's mental health. It has to be an individual case. Why do we have these two differences? And the second thing I wanted to mention is just an example. I talk about it, some people think it's funny, but it was really, at the moment, when it happened, it was funny, but when I reflect upon it, it's not. I was traveling to Cyprus. I was waiting at the airport in Germany, and we saw people were discussing, waiting for the flight, and 3 Muslims were coming. They had a kaftan, and they have hats, and they had bags on their back. And the moment these 3 people were coming, the entire place got very quiet. And I turned around and I saw these 3 guys, and I knew exactly why people got quiet, because they were intimidated. Now you have these 3 terrorists coming. And they all were dressed the same, the stereotypical image of a Muslim. They had beards and they had bags in their back. So we got on the plane, just to make it short, and in the middle of the air, these 3 guys got up, and in the middle of the plane, they pretended to be praying on the aisle. Now, chaos broke loose. Everybody was screaming. The lady that sat next to me held on my arm and thought she was going to die. And I panicked too. I didn't scream, but I felt, what is happening? Are we going to die, actually? And why did I feel that way? Why is it that I, that have been working against, I'm a Muslim myself, working against racism, why is it that that narrative that they have about Islam and Muslims has also affected me and the way I think? Why? And I would like us to if you have any comments or thoughts or reflections on this, what do we need to do in order to be able to change the narrative? And lastly, for those of you, the speakers, I would like you to come up, if you have suggestions, recommendations, if you have at least each one of you 2 recommendations that you think we need to put in this report, please, if you can conclude with that, I would appreciate it. But before that, is there anybody here that would like to say something, ask question, comment, reflect? Yes, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I think a lot of the comments today have shown that we need to do a lot more on educating people. I think a lot of the conversations we've had today, but also previously, has been the fear of the unknown. So if there can be a real focus in the report about how we can better educate the people so that they're not scared of the unknown.
Thank you very much. One thing I forgot to mention is that when we got off the plane, these three guys came, we were laughing, and they were British. They were speaking perfect English, and people thought they were from the Middle East and spoke Arabic and terrorists, and they started laughing, and they said, we knew people were going to react like that, because the moment they saw us, they thought we were terrorists. But if it was somebody that was dressed like Anders Behring Breivik, with a polo shirt and a slicked hair, nobody would react that way. Just a reflection. Let me allow our speakers to conclude by saying your thoughts and reflections, final reflections, but also if you have a possibility to have recommendations, 2 or 3 recommendations, that would be much appreciated. Let's start with Julie. Okay, Dunia then, please.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you.
Ich mich nicht doppelt höre.
Taking up on what has just been said, I think this is very much to do with images that we have in our heads. This is a result of what we see in the media and so on, almost on a daily basis. We have these narrative in our minds associated with certain images, and I think this is how prejudices take root. And it is up to each individual to actually work on him or herself in order to address these prejudices and what has caused them to come forth. For instance, if you panic at the sight of someone. There was recently a situation I was in at an underground station in Vienna. There was sudden screaming, and there was a group of men who had prompted this reaction by their appearance. And so I think we need to work on the images in our own heads, and we must think about the way that Muslims are presented on television and in films and so on. We need to make sure that they're presented in different ways, not the stereotypical ways. And we must not talk about Muslims as much as talk to Muslims. And this will mean that people would actually see things from a different point of view. And I think this would actually help us work on the images in our own minds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Julie?
I would like maybe to reflect on what you've just said and to give some concrete recommendation. I think if we understand Islamophobia as a deeply structural form of inequality and racism, and if we understand Islamophobia as contributing to erode the rule of law and contributing to infringe fundamental rights of all, I think we really need to do. So I would reiterate the need to first review policies when it comes to migration policies, when it comes to security policies, when it comes to also non-discrimination policies, because for the moment in the EU, non-discrimination policies are not preventing Muslim women to be discriminated against in the field of education and employment, areas where we know emancipation is key. So if we really need to ensure we review this kind of policies to ensure that they're actually leading to equality and not contributing to inequalities. For example, action plan against racism that exists in some countries, that exists at EU level, needs to prevent these certain measures in certain policies to actually contribute to racism and to Islamophobia. So we have also, for example, measures in migration policies, and we know how migration policies are also framed on this image of the fear of Muslims taking over Europe. So we need to review all this and ensure that we have a concrete action plan against racism that are going against this kind of measures. And again, I will finish by saying we need strong condemnation of public figures against what's happening when it comes to what's happening in Austria, when it comes to what's happening in France. In France, we have a law that is actually leading to a lot of infringement of rights. Big organizations like Human Rights Watch, like Amnesty International, have actually denounced the French law on strengthening the principle of the Republic, whereby you actually have an increase of discrimination of Muslim women actually in this law, where you have actually the need for some religious institutions to sign a charter of Republican values. There are a lot of very problematic measures in this law. And I think we need to ensure that there is a strong condemnation, especially from European institutions who have some more independence and some more voice to actually go against these very concerning developments. And for example, we've heard about the dissolution of CCIS, and we know that actually the Council of State in France have said that they are dissolving CCIS based on the fact that they have denounced Islamophobia perpetrated by the French state. So it's very, very concerning what's happening in Europe at the moment, and we need strong voices against that. And I think the report, definitely, we really welcome the report, and it's a very first step in this path. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julie. Now let's allow Mr. Choudhury to just short, if you can keep it really short, as you hear the bell is ringing, we need to go vote. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll be very short. Just to reiterate my earlier points about the importance of reviewing all existing legislation and policy to make sure, or to ensure, to look at how it meets standards of equality, non-discrimination and human rights, and to enable and empower equality and anti-discrimination bodies to monitor the way in which counterterrorism measures and policies are impacting on marginalized and minority groups, including Muslims. That would be crucial to challenging the sort of anti-Muslim potential within these policies. And then finally, to think about the role that counterterrorism policies and measures play and contribute towards terrorism. So they're not neutral in this venue, so they can have a role in, and most of the models of radicalization that states use talk about discrimination as being a factor that's conducive to terrorism and radicalization. So we need to think about what role anti-discrimination will play as a key aspect of challenging some of those conditions that are conducive to terrorism.
Thank you very much. I know we have a colleague online that wanted to say something. If you can do it within 1 minute, we would much appreciate it. Mr. Green, the floor is yours. He's not online? Okay, then let me take this opportunity to thank Julie, Tufyal and Dunia for your really very thought-provoking presentations, and really appreciate everything that you said, and I think it's going to add value to the report. Let me thank you also, colleagues, for your contributions. Very appreciated. The findings of this hearing will, of course, feed into the report that I'm currently preparing. And if you have any ideas or thoughts or things that you think needs to be part of the report, please do not hesitate to contact me. On the program, any other business, item 5 of the agenda, does anybody wish to take the floor on any other business? No. The last point on the agenda, it says next meeting. I just wanted to take this opportunity, apart from thanking you all for coming here and listening and participating, to also remind you that on the 25th of October we have a very, very important conference on racism and intolerance. It is the alliance that is organizing it. It's going to take place in Paris. And if you have a possibility of joining us physically, that will be much appreciated. If you do not have a possibility of joining us physically, you can join remotely via Kudo, and you get all the information that you need to be able to join. Again, we see the rise of the far right and extreme right, and we need to create a different narrative. And we can do that as policymakers in our different countries if we come together. So with those words, I want to take this opportunity to thank you so much and wish you a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you.